In this video, I'm going to be continuing on with the equipment series where I go through the rod, reel, and line that I like for a specific technique. Now today is all about fishing a jerkbait, a hard jerkbait. This is one of my absolute favorite techniques. It's something that I fish throughout the entire year, and today we're gonna go through the equipment that I like with a jerkbait. Now, before we get into it, this video is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. And right now over at Finn Fishing, there's just a few more days left in the big holiday sale that I've been running. A lot of items are 20% off. A few items are even 30% off, as well as anyone who buys something in the month of December, just a few more days, is automatically put into a contest to win one of 4 different prizes. I'm giving away 2 one-of-a-kind bass hats. I'm giving away an ARC Tharp Series grinder rod. This is my favorite crankbait rod ever. And I'm also giving away an ARC Gravity 7 reel. So I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description. Shopping at Finn Fishing is truly the best way to help support this channel, and I greatly appreciate all of you who have done so. All right, let's talk about fishing a jerkbait. Like I said, this is really one of my absolute favorite techniques, and it's really become one of my favorite techniques more so because I fish for a lot of smallmouth where I live. I live kind of a little bit more in the Midwest, northern part of the country, and I fished a lot of, you know, the Champlains and the Lake St. Clairs and the Oneidas, those type of lakes where there's a lot of smallmouth. And you pick up a jerkbait a lot in those areas, but I have started to really apply a jerkbait everywhere that I go, because as you guys know, I mean, if you follow, you know, professional bass fishing, a jerkbait is a great year-round lure. It's one that I am starting to use more and more every single year, no matter how warm the water is or even how cold the water is. So anyways, let's talk a little bit about a jerkbait. And I'm actually gonna start with what I think is the most important component of a jerkbait, which is the rod that you use. I truly believe that this is the most important thing when it comes to fishing a jerkbait. Now, when it comes to a rod, if you guys have been around this channel, you know that any time that I am using a hard bait that has treble hooks on it, I typically like a more parabolic bending rod. And I think that this is extremely important because that parabolic bending rod really allows you to keep fish pegged, allows you to not lose nearly as many fish as if you have more of a fast action rod. And so it's no different when it comes to fishing a jerkbait. Now, for the most part, when I'm talking about more parabolic bending rods, I tend to like more composite rods. You know, for example, this is a crankbait rod that I was just talking about a second ago that I love. It is a composite rod, meaning that it's half glass, it's half graphite. The only bad thing about a composite rod in a jerkbait is that composite rods tend to be a little bit heavier than graphite rods. Because of the glass that is in this rod, they tend to be a little bit heavier. Now, I used to use a composite rod for fishing a jerkbait a lot, and it worked, but the biggest thing that it did was it wore out my hand. If I was fishing a jerkbait all day, you know, there's times up in New York, I can remember literally fishing a jerkbait from, you know, 6 or 7 a.m. throughout the entire day. And by the end of the day, you are completely wore out by using a composite rod. So the rod that I have here, I have actually used kind of a very similar rod in a couple of different brands. And this to me is the perfect jerkbait rod. Now this specific brand is ARC. You know, I work with ARC. And so anyways, this is called the ARC One-Eye Jack rod. So this rod is a very parabolic, a very slow rod, but it is pure graphite. So it has a very good bend to it. It bends down here at the, you know, really kind of towards the base, but it's graphite. This thing is extremely light. It's also 6 foot 9 inches. And so I actually like to have a little bit shorter rod with a jerkbait too. You know, for example, this is a 6 foot 9 because when you are constantly working that bait, a lot of times you are working it down. And if you are on a boat or even if you are on the bank and you're working that bait down, if you have a longer rod, the top of your rod is gonna be smacking the water constantly. And we don't want that, you know, or you're gonna be hitting the side of the boat. And so having that little bit shorter rod, I'm telling you, a light, short rod, it just makes for a great day of being able to go out there and fish a jerkbait. So like I said, I've actually used a very similar rod in a number of different brands. You know, I've used one in Abu Garcia, a Daiwa rod. Daiwa has a really good rod that I've used for a number of years too with jerkbait before I found the one-eyed jack. But this by far is my favorite rod when it comes to a jerkbait. And something that's also really important, especially if you are fishing for those smallmouth, is the way that this rod bends is very good for when those fish dig right at the side of the boat. I have lost very few fish with this rod, which a lot of people can't always say when it comes to fishing a jerkbait, a hard bait that has treble hooks on it. So the rod is extremely important to me. It's the most important component. Now I want to talk next about your line. The biggest thing that I have learned over the years about a jerkbait that kind of was different than what I started out fishing a jerkbait is that one, I like fluorocarbon, and two, I don't change up my pound test when it comes to a jerkbait near as much as I used to. And what I mean by that is nowadays I typically am going to use either 10-pound test or 12-pound test when it comes to a jerkbait, with about 90% of the time being 12-pound test. And the reason that I don't change it up, back in the day, if I was fishing really shallow water, I would actually use like 15-pound line because I thought that brought that jerkbait up a little bit. And if I wanted to get that jerkbait deeper, I would use like 8-pound line to try to get that jerkbait deeper. And really what I have found over the years is that one, actually the heavier pound test that you use, especially if it's fluorocarbon, typically the deeper your jerkbait will actually get. Because what happens is when you make a long cast with a jerkbait, you get that line down there below the water. If you start bringing that bait back to you, that line is continually sinking because it's fluorocarbon. So that heavier line tends to weigh down that jerkbait a little bit more, and it'll actually drag your jerkbait down, which helps you to get it a little bit deeper. But it's not significantly. It's not a huge difference when it comes to the jerkbait, which is part of the reason why I don't change up my line a lot anymore. The other thing is that on the flip side, using lighter pound test or whatever, nothing really gets your jerkbait like tremendously more deep than just using kind of that 10 or 12 pound line. And so because of all that, I kind of just stick to 12 and I use 12 all the time. The other thing about a jerkbait is that it has immense drawing power. And what I've learned with fishing a jerkbait is that most of the fish that you catch with a jerkbait will follow that thing from a distance. So you may be fishing a jerkbait in 15 foot of water and you're trying to get that jerkbait as deep as you can, but what you don't know is that your jerkbait is actually only getting about 6 foot below the surface, but bass have no problem coming 8, 9 foot off the bottom to eat it. As a matter of fact, I think the ones that sometimes have to travel further to get it tend to be the ones that get it the best. And so to me, the pound test on a jerkbait, to me, I don't think is extremely important like I used to think it is. So usually it's going to be, like I said, 10 or 12 pound test, and it really just kind of depends on the brand that you're using. Some brands out there will actually be a little bit thicker. That's where I might step it down to 10 pound, where a lot of brands that I use are a little bit thinner, and I really like 12. I think 12 is kind of perfect. The only time that I might change the jerkbait is like if you are fishing down south. You know, if you're fishing down in Texas, you got a lot of standing timber, you got a lot of 8-pound bass, 9-pound bass, 10-pound bass. That might be when you want to kind of step up to 15-pound line, so that if a fish gets you wrapped up in a tree with heavier line, you're going to be okay, versus the 12-pound line, which could break in that situation. So to me, 10 or 12-pound fluorocarbon is the best, and that is why I like it. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is your gear ratio. Now, for the most part, the gear ratio on your reel doesn't really matter when it comes to fishing a jerkbait, because you are nearly 100% of the time working the jerkbait with your rod. So really what you're doing is you're hitting the bait down, you're reeling up the slack. Hitting the bait down, reeling up the slack. So a lot of times, using a gear ratio that's really low versus very fast isn't really going to impact the bait as much. But what I have found is that it impacts the rhythm and the cadence that you do as a person. For example, back in the day when I was a little bit dumber, I would use a really low gear ratio reel with a jerkbait in cold water because I thought I wanted to make that bait be slower down there. And it makes sense, but again, you're bringing up the reel with your slack. You're bringing up the line with your slack. And so, you're bringing up the slack with your reel. So anyways, when you go to pop it a couple of times though, because a lower gear ratio like a 5.1 doesn't pick up near as much line, you end up having to reel more in a matter of seconds to pick up the line. So I really, over the years, stick to something in the 7 range. This is a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio. I think that is perfect. Something between 7.1 and really 7.4, 7.5 is probably perfect. To me, it really gives me this perfect cadence. When I'm out there and I'm snapping that thing down, I know that I'm reeling it. It's usually like a turn or two, half a turn or two when I'm reeling up the slack, instead of using that 5 where I might have to go around a little bit more, and it just becomes too much motion with what you are doing. Okay, so that's really it. The only other time that I will switch up my equipment is when you have to fish really light jerk baits. If you have to fish, for example, like a Smithwick Rogue, although it might be the same size as, for instance, like this Berkley Stunna, it is a very light jerk bait. When it catches the wind, it can be difficult to fish with a bait caster. So there are times throughout the year where I actually switch over to a spinning rod if I'm getting on a good jerkbait bite with a specific jerkbait that is really light in weight. And so that's really the only other time, and I'm gonna use a spinning rod, like I said, typically with straight like 8 or 10 pound test fluorocarbon. So anyways, guys, that's kind of it when it comes to the jerkbait. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you guys in the next one.